Welcome everyone. Today's workshop will be on how to file a rent increase or decrease petition. My name is John Adams and I am a rent analyst or a housing counselor with the Richmond Rent Program. Today's presentation, we will cover the following topics. What is rent control and who can file a petition? The overview of the petition process, the tenant petitions and their descriptions, the landlord petitions and their descriptions, the steps to completing a petition, where to find information on our website, what happens on the day of the hearing, the potential outcomes, and filing an appeal. By the end of this presentation, you should understand the petition process, how to file a petition, and where you can get assistance with the process. Before we begin, there are several important things that you must know before you can file a petition. You must first know what rent control is, the definition of a petition, and who is eligible to file a petition. First, rent control is one of the major components of the Richmond Rent Ordinance, a law passed by the Richmond Public in 2017. Rent control means that the rent board and the rent program have the authority over the amount of rent a landlord collects. What this means is that any adjustment to the rent, for example, any rent increase, must be undertaken with the approval of the rent program. Rent control only applies to certain units, defined as fully covered. Fully covered units are generally those units on multi-unit properties built before February 1st, 1995. For example, both one unit of a duplex or a converted garage built without permits on the same parcel as a single-family home would be fully covered under rent control. Second, a petition is an individual request to the rent program from either a tenant or a landlord to adjust the rent for certain allowable reasons. The process requires the applicant to request and demonstrate the legitimacy of their request to a hearing examiner. The hearing examiner is empowered by the rent ordinance to decide the issue and adjust the rent. Finally, tenants and landlords of fully covered units may file a rent adjustment petition. Since the rent program has control of their units, any adjustment to the rent must go through the rent program. Additionally, a tenant who believes that their unit should be fully covered may also file a petition. For example, a tenant who resides in an ADU that was undisclosed to the rent program by the owner may file a petition of rent overcharge with the belief that their unit should be under rent control. The petition process has the authority to decide the matter. If you have questions about the status of your unit, please consult our workshop on rights and responsibilities for Richmond landlords and tenants, or contact the Rent Program. Now that I've explained the basic definitions of rent control and the petition, next I will explain the step-by-step petition process. First, a petition is filed with the Rent Program. Once the rent program has the petition, the hearing examiner will review it. The review will either deem the petition sufficient for a case or insufficient. If sufficient, the petition will move forward in the process. If insufficient, the applicant will be given the opportunity to correct it. If they do not, then the petition will be dismissed. After the hearing examiner accepts a petition as sufficient for a case, the next step in the process, the objection period, begins. The objection period is when the opposing party is given the opportunity to object to the evidence and the case brought against them. The opposing party may supply their own counter-evidence and a narrative of the facts. For example, let's say a tenant filed a petition for reduced rent on the grounds of a broken heater for 6 months in 2023. In the objection period, the landlord may dispute the claims or the time period and/or offer any evidence that disputes the tenant claims in the petition. The opposing party is given 21 days to object. After the 21-day objection period, a hearing date is scheduled. The time between the objection period and the day of the hearing depends on how busy the hearing examiner's calendar is, but generally varies between 2 and 8 weeks. We will go into detail about what happens on the day of the hearing, but after the day of the hearing, either an agreement is reached by the parties or the hearing examiner writes a decision. Once an agreement is signed or a decision is rendered, the process concludes. A petition may only be filed for certain allowable reasons. For a tenant, those reasons are as followed. Number 1, excess rent due to overcharges not allowed by rent control. This includes security deposits and utilities. I like to think of this petition as the one concerning money, as it is primarily concerns with issues of payment. Examples include a tenant who paid a rent increase that was higher than the rent board allowed, or the payment of unmetered utilities. Number 2, a petition to reduce the rent due to habitability issues or due to a decreased service. California law requires landlords to maintain their properties to a certain standard. If they do not, then the rent ordinance considers that the landlord is not delivering what the rent pays for, and therefore the rent should be reduced. Similarly, if a service is at one time included in the rent and then later denied or withdrawn by the landlord, then it can be argued that the tenant is not receiving what their rent pays for. For example, when a tenant rented a space and it included an outdoor storage unit, but at a later date the landlord removed that storage, then the rent should be reduced accordingly. This level of detail is not required by the petition, but if it helps, the rent board often thinks of usable square footage. The rent pays for 100% of usable square footage. A non-functioning heater or a removed storage space decreases the usable square footage, and therefore the rent should be reduced proportionally. The hearing examiner decides this proportionality. 3. There is a petition to reduce the rent due to the reduction in the number of tenants allowed. If there are multiple tenants in the rental housing agreement and one of them leaves the unit, that tenant may legally be replaced on a one-for-one basis so long as at least one of the original tenants in the rental housing agreement remain an occupant. If the landlord refuses to allow the replacement, then the tenant may request the rent to be reduced. Finally, there is a petition for failure to pay relocation payments. This petition is not a rent adjustment petition, so we will not spend much time on it today. But if a tenant is displaced for certain evictions or under severe habitability conditions, such as with an order from code enforcement, then the landlord may be required to pay relocation fees. Failure to pay those fees may also be brought before the hearing examiner. For landlords, there are 4 rent adjustment petitions available to increase the rents beyond the maximum allowable rent. The Maintenance of Net Operating Income, or the MNOI petition, is available for landlords who are entitled to a fair return on their rental property. The MNOI petition is not a return to market rents. A fair return is defined as the comparison of the net operating income, meaning the gross income subtracted from the operating expenses, before rent control in 2015. It's presumed that before rent control, the landlord maximized their profits. It will compare that gross income to the operating income of the current annual year, which is 2022. An award will be granted in cases where the operating income has not kept up with 100% of inflation. This petition can be complicated, and records for both years are mandatory. If you need assistance, please call the Rent Program. Second, there is a petition to increase the rent based on the number of occupants. If the tenants had increased the number of occupants beyond the base occupancy level, a landlord may request a rent increase. Certain family members are allowed to move in without a rent increase being granted, such as children and spouses. Third, there is a rent increase petition due to the increase in space or services. If a landlord increases the services, such as adds a washing machine, they may petition for a rent increase. And finally, there is a petition to increase the security deposit due to allowing an additional pet. Now that we have covered the petitions and the petition process, next I'm going to go over the process of filing a petition. Step 1. It's always recommended to contact the rent program and speak to a counselor, like myself, to discuss your individual case. Counselors can inform you about your rights and responsibilities and guide you through the process of filing a petition. The petition process can be complicated, and a counselor can provide you with the information to make informed decisions. The Rent Program considers itself a resource for the community, and supporting a robust petition process is a big part of our service. Step 2. Complete the petition packet. Every petition packet should have at least 4 things. First, it should have the introductory petition. For tenants, it's called the Petition for Multiple Grounds, and for landlords, it's called the Petition for Individual Rent Adjustment. I often describe the petition process as an argument, and the actual document is similar to an essay one might write in high school or college. In that analogy, the petition would be the introductory paragraph, or sometimes I call it a cover letter. The purpose is to simply tell the hearing examiner what you are doing, give the basic contact information for all the parties, and explain what information is contained in the rest of the petition. The second thing required is the petition itself. This is the Rent Program's form. Here you must list your claim and describe how you came to that claim. For example, if your petition is a tenant petition for habitability complaints, we literally want a list of each complaint and the date that it started. For example, you might write, "My plumbing stopped working on January 6, 2022. If it is a landlord M&OI petition, we literally want your accountant's line item budget of expenses and income. If it's not listed in your claim, the petition process will not consider the issue. I will talk about the next 2 things required for each petition on the next slides in detail, but they are 3. Evidence or supporting documentation, and 4. The proof of service. By the time you have this completed, your documents might be 20 or 50 pages long, and for an M&OI petition, it may be hundreds of pages. Critical to a successful petition is supporting evidence. To continue the high school or college essay analogy, if the petition is the claim or argument, then the evidence is the proof or support of that claim. Often the legitimacy, provability, and success of the claim depend on the evidence. One side's evidence can be countered by the opposing side. The hearing examiner is the person who will judge the success of what is presented. For everything listed in the claim, there should be supporting evidence. For example, if a habitability petition claims both a broken heater and mold, then the supporting evidence should ideally have both the mold and the heater listed in a complaint and/or a request for repair from the tenant to the landlord. If you have only evidence of the heater, then it is possible that the hearing examiner will dismiss the claim for the mold. For the M&OI petition, if a landlord claims maintenance expenses, then they should have a receipt for every expense. Additionally, organization and timelines matter. If you present an unorganized random assortment of pictures, the hearing examiner will do his best to understand what is presented, but may have difficulty if it is unorganized. A common problem is undated screenshots of text messages. Sometimes we cannot piece the conversation together, and that may cause the claim to be dismissed or deemed insufficient. A simple practice is to use page numbers for your evidence and to write a short description of what the evidence is referencing in the petition. The best practice is to order everything by date. Generally speaking, the more rigorous and comprehensible your evidence, the more likely it is to refute any opposing evidence from the opposing party and to be more convincing to the hearing examiner. What might actually constitute evidence will depend on what petition is filed. Essentially, the evidence can be anything that supports the claim. I have offered some examples of two of the most common petitions. For tenant habitability petitions, the tenant must try to include proof that the landlord knew of the issue, such as an email or letter requesting a repair, pictures of the issue, videos, and receipts of any abatement paid for by the tenant, and so on, are all types of acceptable evidence. For the landlord MNOI petition, the landlord must include expenses and income receipts for both 2015 and the current year, which is 2022. This can be in the form of tax returns, maintenance receipts, labor costs, insurance, utility payments, and so on. You can easily see how this petition might balloon into hundreds of pages. Finally, PDFs of documents are preferred. We often receive JPEGs of documents. These are both difficult to manage and hard to read, and thus diminish the comprehensibility of what is presented. If you're uncertain if you should include something, the best practice is to include it. The hearing examiner can easily dismiss something as irrelevant, but he cannot conjure up something that is not there. The final step in filing a petition is to serve copies. Another way I sometimes think of the petition process is I informally call it rent court. Part of any court proceeding is to serve the documentation to the other side. In the petition, the filer or the petitioner also acts as the server of the documentation. This is a three-step process. First, a copy of everything in the petition packet, including the petition packets and all of the evidence, is given to the opposing party, either the landlord or the tenant. Second, a proof of service is signed. A proof of service is a signed documentation swearing that you serve the documentation to the other side. It includes the name of the person to whom you served it and how you served it, such as in person, by mail, or by email. Third, an exact copy of the documentation and the signed proof of service is given to the rent program. If your copies are missing anything, including the proof of service, then the petition will be deemed insufficient. Now that I have chronicled the petition process and the steps for filing a petition, the next thing I want to cover today is where to find all this information on our website. From our website, you can download all of the forms and the instructions. First, go to the City of Richmond's homepage. This can be found by Googling the City of Richmond, California, or by typing in ci.richmond.ca.us into the URL space on a web browser. Once on the city's homepage, hover the mouse over the department list on the top. This will drop down and reveal the city departments. From here, find and click on the Richmond Rent Program. This will take you to the Richmond Rent Program's homepage, which should look something like this. There are two ways to navigate to the petitions page. The first is to click on the box in the center of the homepage, entitled Rent Adjustment Petitions. The second is to use the navigation tabs on the side. To do this, you would first find the Forms and Notices tabs and click the plus symbol, which will expand the tabs. Near the bottom of the expansion, you will find the Petitions form. You can click on that page. Clicking on either of those buttons will navigate you to the Petitions Forms page. At the top of the page, you should find the general instructions that we covered in detail today. Scrolling midway down the page, you should find the tenant petitions listed. You should see attachments A, B, C, and the petition for failure to pay relocation payments. And lastly, as you scroll down near the bottom of the web page, you will find the list of landlord petitions. Next, I want to explain what happens on the day of the hearing itself. I often say that the day operates like informal court. Informal meaning that a lawyer is not required and no party will be penalized for improper procedures, but formal in that the hearing examiner is empowered to make a decision and does have the authority of the law. The hearing examiner will walk the parties through introductions, a swearing in, a presentation of the cases, a chance for rebuttal by the opposing side, and any cross-examination for clarification that the hearing examiner requests. The guiding principle of the hearing examiner is to be fair, to determine the facts, and to apply the law. On the day of the hearing, there are two possible outcomes. First, the parties may settle. A settle agreement is when both sides voluntarily agree to a set of conditions. Generally, the hearing examiner will write out the agreement and both parties will sign the agreement on the day of the hearing. A settlement agreement may not be appealed and is considered the conclusion of the process. The second option is a decision by the hearing examiner. When the parties cannot reach an agreement, they may defer to the hearing examiner to decide the outcome for them. The hearing examiner is empowered to interpret the law, evaluate the evidence, and decide the outcome. It will generally take the hearing examiner up to several weeks to write a decision. The hearing examiner's decision has the authority of the law and will be the conclusion of the issues unless an appeal is sent to the rent board. Finally, either the tenant or the landlord may appeal a decision of the hearing examiner. An appeal is a claim that the hearing examiner's decision is somehow flawed. For example, he either misinterpreted the law or improperly used his discretion. It is important to understand that an appeal is not a retrial of the case. It is a dispute of the hearing examiner's decision. If the rent board feels the case should be retried, then through the appeal, the rent board would remand the case back to a hearing examiner and the process would start again. An appeal must be filed within 35 days of the hearing examiner's decision being mailed. The 5-member rent board act as the quasi-judges and will hear the appeal arguments. That is to say that the claim and the case of the hearing examiner's flaw must be brought to and argued in front of the rent board. The rent board may take the following actions. They may reverse the decision and rule in favor of the party opposite of the hearing examiner. They may affirm the decision, that is, they may agree with the hearing examiner. They may remand the decision, that is, order the hearing examiner to hear the case again, or they may modify the decision, that is, to change one or many individual components of the hearing examiner's decision. The rent board's decision of appeal can be further appealed to Superior Court. The appeal is the final step that either party may take and concludes the case with the rent program. This concludes our workshop, and thank you for taking the time to listen. If you have further questions, then please reach out to the rent program.